Welcome back to LaidOPEN podcast. This is your host, Charna and today's guest, Allison Guilbault, is such a fascinating human. She's really had some rigorous training in unusual environments versus like a straightforward psychotherapeutic path. She was interested in forensic psychology and worked with the FBI, and she worked in Rikers prison in solitary confinement. So she really has an unusual vantage point working with offenders as well as victims. And we talk about her life and her relationship to making decisions and living a more aligned existence, and how that now informs the work she does in her private practice in Jersey. She really has a passion for working with people and helping them heal from trauma, but also living lives that are free of shame and building up their sense of confidence. So at this point, most of her private practice is made up of women. Men out there can also really receive some value from this conversation we're about to have. So I hope you enjoy. Learn how to live embodied. Your life is about to unwind. Uncover new tools and start healing. Leave trauma and tension behind. Isn't it great, laid open? Let all your desires come true. How can you live laid open? Imagine yourself brand new. Imagine yourself brand new. Welcome, Allison. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I feel like this timing is exciting because I know that recently you've had some pretty awesome things happening in your life. And I would love if you would give us a little update about all these awesome interviews that you've been doing recently.
Yeah. So I am a therapist in New Jersey. I specialize in anxiety and trauma and sex and intimacy. But of late, probably the last, I'd say, year or so, I have been appearing on a lot of podcasts. I started my own podcast. I've been doing a lot of speaking events, and it's been very exciting. I often talk to women, and feel free to listen, but usually my audience is women. And I've been doing a lot of talks on mindset change, confidence building. You know, I have a background in that mindset work and cognitive behavioral therapy. So I've just been trying to help people kind of let go of their shame and their guilt and their limiting beliefs, all that stuff that holds them back, and
Mm-hmm.
connect into, more of their higher purpose.
And you recently you were interviewed in Time Magazine?
Yeah. Yeah, I did an interview in Time Magazine. I'm quoted, and it was a really interesting article. I was in an article on loneliness.
Mm.
So they wanted to know, how is loneliness showing up for people? What kind of recommendations did I have? And it's a funny topic because what I told them, and now I'll tell you, is I think a lot of people are suffering from loneliness, and somehow there's some strange element of shame to it. Like,
Mm-hmm.
people don't often show up to therapy and say, like, I'm feeling lonely, right? They'll say sort of something adjacent to that, like, I don't really connect to my friends anymore. I'm feeling bored. So yeah, we kind of like deep dove into, if we're having this sort of universal experience, how to kind of move through it, what to do.
Mm-hmm. This real
Yeah.
lingering loneliness
Yeah.
post-COVID
Exactly.
and people moving from that space of isolation. And it seems like it's a bit of a paradox because there's the desire to connect, but then less capacity and energy to leave home and to less bandwidth to spend time with people, right?
Exactly.
It's
Yeah.
just really interesting. It's like, if somebody has been bedridden and they've lost the physical muscle tissue, I mean,
Hmm.
muscle to do things, and they've lost that strength. I feel like that's what's happened. We've like atrophied emotionally.
Yeah. That's a good way to
Wow.
put it.
So this is something I'm really curious about. You have a remarkable background that has quite a range in terms of environments you've worked in and populations you've worked with. And then you had this wake up, right? You went
Mhm.
from working in Rikers in a prison setting,
Yeah.
right? with offenders. You also worked with the FBI and you're doing research around the homicide of sex workers,
Mhm.
right? So you have this all this range
Yeah.
there. And then one day you had this wake up where you're like, I don't want to do this anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so my question for you, because I feel like it has to have given you some um a skill set for the work that you're doing now. But what was the emotional and the sensational experience of that I am done?
Yeah, it even predated a little bit of the Rikers.
Yeah.
So I started my career working in a hospital. I was doing trauma work
Mm,
and I really loved it. I was the first person that if someone came into the emergency room in the immediate aftermath of a sexual assault or domestic violence, I would be the first person to see them and I would
mm,
help them get connected to services, make sure that they're emotionally okay. If they wanted to talk to a police officer, dot, dot, dot. And I loved that work. But because I was working with the FBI, I suddenly birthed this career in private investigation.
mhm,
I was really good at research, right? But the fact that I had worked with the FBI was impressive to a lot of people. I was being recruited. And so I had almost a 10-year, almost a decade of this career that kind of took me off of path. It
mm,
was close proximity to what I had been doing, right? It was under forensics and things like that. And, the story I sort of tell is one day I was sitting in this meeting and I joke now that like my hustle was aligned with pressure and not passion. I was working so hard. I was always the first person in the office. I was always the last person to leave. I had terrible work life balance and I was climbing a corporate ladder. I was objectively successful and I was just kind of miserable and not so miserable that it was obvious in my face. It was almost like subtle misery. And I just sat in this office one day and I was like, what am I doing with my life? Like, I'm so far from where I wanted to be. I wanted to help people and I'm not, and I think that was like a huge, like I burnt out and I left that meeting. Immediately walked into my therapy office
mm,
and my therapist, and I was like, how I'm so stuck in my life, right? I'm making poor decisions. I'm misaligned. I'm just not doing it. I'm not happy or fulfilled. And she helped me file like an immediate leave of absence. And I was just like, I need to go and I need to go now
mhm,
and, that's what ultimately kicked me into sort of the Rikers work. So I give these speeches when I do public speaking, right? And I'm like, listen, if you are stuck in your life, if you are not fulfilled in your life, you do have the power to make this huge change. And I think people agree with me up to you can make the change, right? And so often when I tell my story, people will say things like, okay, but how easy for you, right? I have kids or I have a mortgage. I've already climbed the corporate ladder. So an important part of my story that I tried to beat is I had nothing to fall back on. I had an enormous debt because I had put myself through school. I had a big New York City rent. I had climbed this corporate ladder with no backup plan whatsoever. So when I quit, it was really like jumping into the universe with no plan whatsoever. And I remember thinking like, well, what do I want to do when I grow up? And I was in my, mid 30s at this point. It's not like I was, at a spring chicken. And I thought, I loved helping people. I loved doing trauma work. I loved being in fast paced environments. And so I actually had to go back to school in my mid 30s. And, I had to take an internship that was unpaid and I
mhm,
had no way to pay my bills. I was used to a corporate salary. So I actually begged a friend of mine to let me bartend at his bar. So making way less money. And that was really all of it was really hard. But I think if I had continued on the path that I was on,
mm,
that would have been arguably so much harder, right? And, now I'm at the other end of that where I have had this diverse career since making that decision. I worked at Rikers Island. Did trauma work. I now own my own practice. I publicly speak all over the world. I travel the world, and I sort of believe like I wasn't special. And if I could do this, so can everybody. But, often people's limitations are really just in their own mind. We've created all the stories of why we can't do something. And when we just start to shift that mindset, it doesn't mean that you're not going to come with hardships or dreams aren't hard to be made. But it does mean that at least you're opening the doors to them, which
mm.
I don't think I had an awareness that that was even possible until that aha moment.
Yeah. Well, and there's also there's the in my experience, leaving situations that feel untenable,
Mhm.
there's a hollowness, there's that done feeling. And I'm
Yeah.
thinking specifically relationships. And so
Yeah.
I, it's like I guide my clients in that way. It's like, well, what's the physical experience internally? And if you feel like you vacated the building,
Yes.
right, your body is dialing it in. Um, there's also the question that comes up for me is who were the people? What were the resources? I love that you had this therapist that helped you
Mhm.
file that and helped you kind of turn the ship around
Yeah.
and what else built up your resilience enough to make that courageous choice?
I wish I could say that it was, maybe so much resilience. I think at
Mhm.
some point it was really more powered by that burnout, right? So
Yeah.
I was very fortunate to have a really good therapist. I'm biased as hell, but I believe everybody should find a therapist. Therapists are worth their weight in gold. But I do have good friends and I do have a supportive family.
Mhm.
My mother was particularly terrified when I was like, "Hey, I'm leaving my six-figure salary and I'm gonna bartend happy hour on the Upper East Side from 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock, and I'm gonna take out another loan." And even worse, when I got my, job at Rikers Island, she was like, "You left all of that for this, right? This
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
banana pancakes." But you find, I think the support that I found was really, it sounds so cliche when I say this stuff, but it's like it was self-trust,
Mhm.
right? Like suddenly turning my mantra into like, I can do hard things.
Yeah.
Right? How do I know? Because look, I'm doing this thing. It's already hard, right?
Mhm.
And just like there has to be a better way. I haven't figured out what the better way looks like yet, but I know that there is a better way. So just that little spark of, I don't know, self-awareness that I can do difficult, like I guess that's where the resilience lies. And self-trust, like just I have to start to listen to my intuition rather than all of these voices telling me what I'm supposed to be doing. And it's funny that you mentioned relationships because yeah, I had the same sort of burnout. And I don't actually know that I've ever equated it this way. So
Mhm.
thank you. I called off my wedding 6 weeks to walking down the aisle. Right. And that was particularly difficult
Mm.
in sort of the same way as my job. Right. I wasn't inherently miserable. It was just I wasn't aligned, right?
Yeah.
Like, it was just the wrong guy. It was just the wrong person for me. And, you know, too many people kind of shut down their intuition that's speaking to them, right? Like, I like what you said,
Yeah.
vacate the building. It's like, if we drop into our bodies and we really like, we have wisdom, right? There is
Mhm.
an internal dialogue that is telling us what we need to hear. It's just like finding the space and the clarity to actually receive those messages because we're very smart. We know what we need. It's just overriding the anxiety or the doubt to like start to listen to it.
Right, the dismissing, and I always make that distinction with folks, right? There's hearing the message, and
Hmm.
then there's actually responding to it. And so being self-responsive is this really key piece there, right? Because often you'll hear that intuitive voice, and then people will argue with it. They'll
Hmm.
justify, it's like, "Oh, but I can't afford, but I have this rent, but
Yeah,
I'm used to this quality of life, but and so on,
all of
right?
it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I mean, I think it's an incredibly courageous thing when people will do that with a wedding, especially if they've been sold that as the path. Like, okay, this is the move. I'm supposed to, get married and have a kid by this
Uh,
age and do this thing. And, you know, uh,
yeah.
it's
Yeah.
amazing how many people do it.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and and then 10 years later,
Yeah.
they're
Ritual.
like, yeah, I was actually never really in love with that person. It was
Yeah.
just like what we were supposed to do.
Yeah, it's funny speaking to like you listening to your intuition and yet dismissing it. So
Hmm.
much of my self-talk at that time was like, well, this is just cold feet. And then even worse, I was sort of like
Yeah.
outwardly putting it out into the world and then other people responding that way. And, it was a horrible decision at the time. I disappointed a lot of people. I was close to my would have been
Mhm.
in-laws,
Mm.
but I actually ran into my ex at a wedding maybe like 2 years ago and he came up and, like, bought me a drink and was like, "Hey, to that bullet dodged," right? Like, "I did not know what you knew then, but now I'm actually happily married. I have beautiful children. Like, what would our relationship have looked like?" Right?
Yeah.
And, it's kind of thank you for having the courage to sort of do the thing I didn't wanna do because I felt like I was letting the world down,
Mm.
right? It felt embarrassing to say, like, "Hey, we're supposed to get married and we've changed our minds," right? Changing your mind is not something that's often encouraged, right? And I always tell that to clients, like, give
Mm.
yourself permission to change your mind.
There's also this theme, if we can kind of spin back to, I call it spinning the lazy Susan.
Yeah.
Like, let's go back. So the thing of like what we feel embarrassed, what we feel shame around, and there's this piece of it's like, oh, God forbid we're lonely.
Yeah.
That we're supposed to have everything figured out. We're supposed to have a full social life. We're supposed to be, gosh, if I'm about to get married to this person, I'm supposed to be. So all the supposed tos rather than
Mhm.
what's actually occurring for me, you
Yeah,
know,
absolutely.
and and the powerlessness, because I often think of when there's shame, shame is an alternative because powerlessness is so intolerable. Like even though shame feels terrible, we'd rather feel shame than
Mhm.
powerless in a situation,
Sure.
right? Like here I am, I'm powerless to make this the right person for me to marry,
Yeah,
right? I'm powerless to control everyone's judgment of me if I walk away.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Yeah.
and I know shame is something that you, again, having worked with survivors as well as offenders,
Mhm.
I often think from a somatic vantage point of the body of shame, right?
Mhm.
How shame lives in the body and how it shapes us. And you have a really special vantage point given the populations you've worked with. And so I'm curious if you could say more about that.
Yeah, I say to clients, like, shame is one of the most immobilizing things because it's so big, like, it's such a big emotion that we almost don't get to the lower levels, right? It's just like, using loneliness as an example, if I feel shameful that I'm lonely because I've internalized it as like, well, I'm not good enough or no one else
Mhm.
experiences this, we're not actually addressing the loneliness,
Mhm.
right? And I'm all about somatic psychology. I truly believe it's somewhat ridiculous that we have health and mental health, right? Like our mind body connection is really powerful. So, I mean, it can figuratively immobilize you, right? But then it also can cause all sorts of body issues, right? Like we can get headaches, we can get depressed, we can have trouble getting out of bed, we can have skin issues, right? So it's like all of these big feelings have just such huge impact on our experience as an entire human being. When I was at Rikers, their philosophy of mental health treatment was very grounded in what's called dialectical behavioral therapy. I have a love-hate relationship with DBT, but one of the foundations of DBT is mindfulness.
Mhm.
And up until that experience, even with all my degrees in mental health, I had really thought mindfulness meant like yoga, meditation. Like I had a misconception of what that meant. And now what I better understand it to be is just noticing what's happening without judgment,
Mhm.
right? I am feeling lonely and I'm feeling shameful that I feel lonely, right? I want to have a fulfilling sex life and yet it's difficult for me to keep the lights on, right? I want to have a good relationship with my food, but I still find myself drawn to diet culture, right? It's like these things can coexist. And if
Mm.
we shame them or we judge them, we don't work through them, right? And then it shows up in our relationships, it shows up in our decision making, it shows up in our body, all the things.
Absolutely. It's foot on gas, foot on brake is how I
Yeah.
think of it, where I had a client that I worked with intermittently for over a decade, and there was the I'm married to a man and I don't want to have sex with him,
Mhm.
right? Or I'm married to a man and I want to explore being queer. I'm,
Yeah.
and those internal conflicts when we
Yeah.
can't accept, it's basically just like keeping the brake on when we
Yeah.
accept ourselves. Yeah.
And when we acknowledge whatever we're experiencing, it doesn't mean we immediately have a solution. And actually I resonate to that story. I have the same story. I'm married to like a hetero guy and, I've been with him for a long time. And I was like, I'm pretty positive that I'm bisexual. And like now I'm in this committed relationship. And I struggled with that
Mm.
for so long because the fear and the shame kept me from like acknowledging it, from fearing that he was gonna feel rejected, that he was gonna feel like something was wrong with him. And eventually we got to the point to just talking about it and like giving it a voice.
Hmm.
And, we were able to work through it. Right. And on it for me, and this is certainly not everybody's experience, almost just owning it. Actually, that was all I actually really needed.
Mhm.
right? It was just like, "Wait, hey, it is part of my existence
Mhm.
is real, and I'm not gonna, like, put that brake on it constantly. I'm gonna give it a little bit of put a little pedal on the gas, right? Feel like gas on the pedal." And it just there is levity now that I have spoken this truth, my truth into existence. It is part of my story. And, all of that, it's important. Important to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, well, and you're also giving this person who loves you the opportunity to love all of you,
Mhm,
including the part that may create some anxiety,
mhm.
right? Um, and then you get to hold it together rather than feeling so alone because things feel so big inside you, right?
Mhm.
When you don't give them voice or when you don't have permission to attend to them.
Yeah, I love that word permission. I'm always encouraging clients. I'm like, what do we need to give ourselves permission for? Maybe we need to give ourselves permission to take up more space or permission to let something go or permission to just
Mhm.
feel a certain way. And that's a lot of the language that I use. I think it's super important.
Mhm. Mhm. Absolutely. And in that conversation, did you talk about the different possibilities of existing outside of monogamy
Yeah.
and,
Mhm.
whether it's you bring in a third
Yeah.
to be with the two of you?
I almost find that, like, and maybe this is just my experience as a therapist, but like a
Yeah.
lot of the clients that I work with, I think maybe are in some part representative of either something that I've already explored and have lived experience with, or something that, you know, not necessarily I'm interested in, but it's something I resonate with. And
Mhm.
so much of my private practice career, right, post the trauma work,
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
worked primarily with the queer community.
Mhm.
And I worked with a ton of people that, in this day and age, had run by a different few names, right? We can call it
Mhm.
polyamorous, polygamous. Most commonly, I think they call it ethical non-monogamy. So I had a huge baseline. Like I'd read all the books because I had
Mhm.
worked with these clients and I wanted to have the language. So when I sat down with my husband, I was like, hey, here's all the options on the table, right?
Okay.
And, it was a huge lesson for us. Ultimately, we did not open up our marriage. And that was a decision that we mutually had to come through together, right? And so, again, I'm a big fan of therapy. We worked with a couples therapist who specialized in that. And we kind of worked through all of the hurdles. We went through all the options and then ultimately landed on the one that felt the most comfortable for both of us. And I give mad props to all of the people who are in open relationships. I think they have to
Mhm.
do so much more work,
So
right?
much.
They have to work with like expectations, better communication. They have to really look at their jealousy. Ultimately, where my husband landed was just like that was just not something that he could, that he was open to. And then
Mhm.
I had to kind of look at like sort of risk reward, right? Like, okay, so this is important to me, but so is my husband, right?
Mhm.
And, that is a difficult thing to navigate because the last thing you want to feel is resentful or so we almost, even though we were at a divide, we had to find a way to mutually agree uh,
Mhm.
that this was going to be okay. And we've kind of left the door open. And I think maybe that just alone with like sort of the softness that I needed. It was like, okay, this isn't a permanent, this is a forever decision. This is just a right now decision. And we can
Exactly.
always come back to the table. And I think honestly, just that speaking it into the universe, that having the tough, difficult conversations, understanding that we have more work to do. I'm also very fortunate. My partner, even currently now, he's like reading the books and trying to understand more about it so he can come from a more informed decision. Um, so that's, couple partnerships are hard, marriage is hard, right? And this is a lot of the work that it takes. Like what happens as marriages evolve
Mhm.
when two people start to divide, and that's almost natural, right? We don't always grow in the same path. And so
That's
like
right.
how do we find our way back to each other?
Mhm.
Right? And that takes trust and communication and honesty.
Right. 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 And I think one of the things that you pointed out is really important is, we can think of things like relationships or compromise. And one of my teachers, Stan Tatkin, talks about it a little bit differently, which I appreciate, which is talking about negotiation instead of
Mhm.
compromise, right? And so, how can it's like you want this and you want this, two very different things, but how do you stay in the conversation long enough so that you can both come to an agreement where there's peace? And I think that that piece of like, this is where we are now. This is
Mhm.
not a forever, so that it's not like 5 years from now, if you need to bring this conversation up again,
Yeah.
he's betrayed and he's like, "You said you never wanted to open the marriage because that's, it's not honest, but it's like creating enough security right now and also letting off some of that, perhaps the pressure if you hadn't given it voice at all, but to both not be in resentment so that you can keep growing in the same direction and know that you're being honest with one another versus like it comes out sideways, right?
Right. Exactly that. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I'm glad that you have
Mhm.
a great willing partner. I mean, I think that's important. You're like, it's work. It's
It
not just
it's
gonna happen.
that's true.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Mhm. Yeah. And and so in terms of what you said is also I see that being very true. We attract clients and maybe it's not to the same degree, but I started noting that over the years, like 20 years, pretty early on, and be like, wait, there's a theme here. Right? Like, they'd come in threes, and maybe they'd escalate just a little bit, each person, like, not happy in my relationship, the next person is actually cheating, the next person is having multiple affairs, the next it's like and
Yes.
so then you get a chance to reflect on your own inner landscape,
Yeah.
and so along those lines, are there certain themes that you're seeing in the work that you're doing with your clients currently?
Yeah, so because I did all the trauma work and I do love trauma work, I just
Mhm.
naturally gravitate towards it. I've always been like a fast-paced person. And so, I just find that I have really good connections with my trauma clients. And of late, I've really moved away from that.
Mm,
And I've been thinking like, what's that all about? And the type of client that I'm now pulling in probably I don't know, most commonly is this high functioning woman who's really successful, who feels stuck in her life.
mm.
Right. And I've been thinking a lot about how, I think that has shifted, my career has shifted in that direction because I shifted in that direction.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm almost speaking to myself 10 years ago. Right. Where from the outside, when I was back in that PI job, everyone, I think, if I had collected the experiences of all the people around me, like, what do you think of Allison? I think that they all would have marked me as high working, high achieving, right? A hustler, got it all together in a good relationship. And internally, I was a hot mess, right? Like, I was
Mhm.
not believing in myself. I was, feeling so much pressure. I was feeling so much shame. I was feeling so much guilt. I was people pleasing. I had poor boundaries.
Mm,
And now that is the type of client I attract, right? And I just
mhm.
love working with them because if I could sit down and say like, okay, well, what if we just like, I was saying to a client today, right? They were commenting on their relationship and they were just using all these words like, I mean, I guess I'm kind of worth it. I think I may be lovable, right? And I was like, do we hear it, right? Like, what if we just tweak that sentence? Like, what would happen if you just showed up for yourself in this moment, right? Just you and me, no one else is here. We can feel a little cheesy about it. And just say, like, I am lovable, period.
Mm,
I deserve a healthy relationship, full stop. Right. And I just love doing that work. And I'm sure that it is very grounded in, my lived experience.
mhm. And, I did listen to some other podcasts you were interviewed on, but the fascination with
Yeah.
forensics, homicide, all of that, do you have more awareness of what drew you to that?
You
Or is
know,
it
that is
just yeah.
that is the golden question, right? So I developed this like morbid curiosity from when I was like a kid. So, and this was I'm 42, right? So I'm like an 80s to 90s baby. And this was before the emergence of like the SVUs, the CSI. Like now if I say I'm into forensics, like everybody kind of has an archetype for that, pretty much because of TV and media.
Mhm.
This was before that, right? So I was like 10. And, we're sitting around and like teachers like, Jennifer, what do you want to become? I want to become a vet. You, what do you want to become? I want a nurse. And I just like, I want to work with serial killers. And my mom was just like, what is this about? And truth be told, we've never figured out the answer.
Mhm.
I loved true crime before it was popular to do it.
Mm.
I have luckily never experienced some big,
Mhm.
sort of forensically involved anything. So it doesn't that part doesn't come from lived experience.
Mhm.
And then I remember when SVU, the TV show came out, like I was like, this is my dream job. Like this is what I want to do. And when I went to college, like the programs didn't exist yet. Now they do, but they didn't, right? So there was maybe like one, I think in Australia, and like one program in America that dealt with forensics. And so, I went instead for psychology. And at the time it was called women's studies. Now more appropriately, it's called, gender and sexuality studies.
Mhm.
So I double majored in that. And then very luckily, after I graduated, there was a school in New York, John Jay, that specializes. It's John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and they had
Mhm.
just opened a big program in forensics, in
Mhm.
forensic psychology. So that's where I did actually both of my masters.
I know that for me, I wouldn't wish sexual trauma on anybody, but I know that healing myself through certain experiences gives me the capacity to guide people in a very particular way from the inside out
Mhm.
and to be like, I stand as an example, right? And so it's always a fascinating thing for me that when people can actually help people heal through something that is not it's not a personal lived experience, right?
Yeah.
At that
Yeah.
it's like these are built skill sets over time through
Hmm.
study and through research and yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
When you were working in Rikers, did you experience vicarious trauma?
I mean, absolutely. So,
Yeah.
Rikers was honestly single-handedly, I think, my favorite job. So when I say that, it almost sounds like it was a
Yeah.
good experience. And to me, the reason that it was my favorite job is it was the most life-defining and powerful job that I had.
Mhm.
Rikers is a terrible place, right?
Yeah.
I got the job there and I just knew I would do mental health work. And then they placed me in solitary confinement
Ugh.
with
Yeah.
all males who all had some sort of a diagnosis, right? So they all had like a
Mhm.
mental, they call it SMIS inside of that kind of system. But it just meant they had a severe mental illness. So they were anti-personality disorder, borderline personality disorder. They were having antisocial personality disorder,
Mhm.
all sorts of schizophrenia, right? Like these big ticket mental health issues.
Right.
And I had no idea what to expect. And the first day that I was there, it was like my training day. It was like a snowstorm. And Rikers is a strange place to just access. So you can't like drive up and get into the system. You like stop and take a city bus, and then there's like a whole intercity bus system inside. So it took me a long time from like the gate to get to where I had to go. And it had been a big snowstorm and I had like high heels on because I was like, oh, job interview. And like I'm meeting my big boss. And luckily I had like my Uggs in my backpack. And I remember showing up and like sitting down, and it was just sort of the interview training part. And she was like,
Mm.
hey, I hope to hell that you don't have high heels because you need different shoes in case you need to run. And I was like, in case I need to run. Okay,
Mhm.
so I swapped out my shoes, left my heels in her office, and then the next stage was, like, taking off all of my jewelry, in case someone could grab you by the necklace or, like, pull an earring, and then they made me watch a video of the person I was replacing who had her jaw broken, and they had it on video, right? So it was like this was my introduction into this life,
Mhm.
and, it's like, "Hey, this is a place where danger and violence is very opportunistic. And so you have to almost become very hyper aware of your surroundings. You have to really practice like street smarts inside of here. And, solitary confinement, I think immediately when we think of that, we're like, what a horrible thing. And when I actually, then this is not to justify solitary confinement, but when I actually started working there, what I found is a lot of the people would do something. A lot of the inmates would
To
fight a
get
guard, right?
to
Fight
get
a
placed.
to get police there because it was actually a safer space for
Mm.
them than in like Gen Pop, right? With all the other inmates. And all of that, right, was just an awakening to me. And I remember sitting with like one particular the guys loved coming to see me, not because they wanted mental health treatment, but because they got out of their cell, right? So they would get to meet me. It was like I had a huge engagement rate. We would do group therapy and they would get access to me twice a week, individual. And I remember this guy telling me this story and thinking to myself, you know, would I behave any differently if I had endured all of the things that he endured, right? Watching his mother get murdered, watching his father get murdered, watching his brother get murdered, right? Having to initiate into a gang when he was 8 years old, right? Like 8 years old, right? I was playing with Barbies. And, it was just an enormous awakening for me to just what trauma can do to someone. And this certainly isn't to say that I'm like excusing criminal behavior, but it did lead me to have a better understanding that just, how people, if we are going to function well as a society, people really do need access to services, right? We need fundamental healthcare, we need good education, we need all of the things, because left to your own device without all that stuff, it's very, very hard to lead a well-adjusted life.
Well, and it's you know, I initially asked this question about vicarious trauma,
Yeah.
right? And because there is this kind of burnout that people can experience sitting with people and
Yeah.
their trauma. And then also you describe the environment that you're in where there's a level of vigilance. I mean, when you describe that and you mentioned her jaw being broken, I don't know what you were feeling in your body when you said that, but I could suddenly feel this
Yeah.
heat and tension and fear in my chest, like into my throat, you know?
Yeah.
And to be able to function just like you do when you're a doctor, you have to kind of dissociate and numb out and compartmentalize. And then if you're sitting in that, I don't know how many hours a day you did that, but then
Mhm.
turning that off becomes really hard.
Yeah.
Going back to life and turning, not being vigilant and not
Yeah.
compartmentalizing, right?
Absolutely.
Mhm.
I had a whole like self-care system where every day I was there 3 days a week.
Mhm.
And every day there was like a cute little pizza bar type thing at the end of, the bridge. And I
Mhm.
would go there by myself and just sit at the bar and order a pizza. And I would sit there and try to actually envision like leaving all of the things I picked
Mm.
up like at that bar. Like when I come in, I'm gonna drop it at the door. And when I go home, it's still here. I'll pick it up tomorrow. But like I can't carry all of this home with me. And I had a great therapist who kind of like guided me through that tool.
Yeah.
Um, and it fundamentally did help me. Also, I'm a very visual person. So it was nice to
Mhm.
be like, here, I'm putting all this weight that I've picked up. It cannot come home with me. And, that's not an easy skill too. I think anybody who does, intensive work has to build some, whether we're compartmentalizing or just some resilience to it all. That's difficult, right? Because I think anybody who's drawn to sort of mental health work, you're naturally empathetic, right? Like you don't get into this field if you don't care about people. So caring about people and not taking it home can be it can be difficult.
Right. Well, and I think that's super valuable. It's similar with hypnotherapy where, energy follows intention. So you were very much intending and you were visualizing and putting things in a particular place to be held so that you didn't have to take it with you. So it's
Mm.
they've done studies and it's proven like it's valuable to visualize, right? Yeah, so that was another one of my questions was in terms of what was your self-care then?
Yeah.
How did you manage on a daily basis? And then there's also the piece that, I feel like I just need to name, which is being a woman, mostly, like working with
Yeah.
male prisoners.
Yeah.
They're probably just thrilled to get to be around you because you're a woman as well,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
out of their cell and in the
Yeah.
presence of a woman, right?
Yeah, and I mean, and that's all real, so
Mhm.
it is part of the story. I heard all the things. I joke now that like there's nothing that you can say to me. There's nothing vulgar I could hear at this stage that I haven't already heard before.
Mm,
There's like a famous scene in Silence of the Lambs where, he's like masturbating in front of her, and that is a real thing that
mhm,
happens. And all the education in the world like does not prepare you for that. Right. And I primarily worked with all actually, if I think about it, I worked with all women. I was super fortunate. I had like the greatest supervisor in the world who really, again, speaking this stuff into the truth, right? She held nothing back. I remember my first week of training. She was like, you are going to be called every name under the sun. You are going to be hearing sexual slurs, right? You are going to witness sexual acts. And we always debrief, right? So we have to leave shame at the door. We have to leave embarrassment at the door. If this happens to you, I need you to immediately come to me. And in my exit letter, when I wrote to her, like, please keep that as part of your training. Because I actually think if you hadn't set
mm.
that tone for me, I would have thought I was doing something wrong. I would have been
Oh,
very embarrassed to tell my supervisor that like I was called this or hurt I'm a human being, right? And it did, we did regularly debrief of what it's like to do, that work. And it was powerful and enlightening and also, at times terrifying and traumatic.
Well, and, I think about what it's like to sit in a room with someone who's borderline, who very typically they can't tolerate their own emotional landscape. And so they're going to project it out like any shame, any powerlessness, any rage, they'll
Mhm.
project it
Of
onto you.
course.
And so if you're in a situation where people, almost everybody has some kind of rigid mental illness diagnoses, you have a shit storm, right? Coming at you of
Yeah.
all of these really hard emotions that
Yeah.
people don't know how to hold.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. I used to call it early on because it seemed like I always had at least one client that took all of my energy and like all my supervision time, right? And I'd be like, I felt like I was the shit screen, and I'd be like, and then at a certain point, I was like,
Mm.
I'm not letting people take a shit on my face anymore. It just doesn't
That
happen. I don't have those.
it's actually so true because I do so much mindset work both in my
Mhm,
own, in my own learning and then also what I speak about. And we talk about self-worth. And a lot of the times when we're talking about self-worth, it's, in relation to the salary we make or a good relationship. But just sort of like, I'm not gonna let anybody shit in my face anymore, right? Like that is immediately irrelevant to our self-worth, right? It's just like, nope, not gonna stand for this anymore. At Rikers, I had in later after some of my tenure there, I had the person who hired me
mhm.
came to me and said, the thing that spoke to me on your resume wasn't actually anything to do with mental health. It was the fact that you had bartended for 20 years and, I had off and on. Right. And she was just like, yeah, okay, you know how to deal with drunk people. So, you know what? Hopefully you're going to be able to learn to deal with these guys. Right. You know how to de escalate stuff. So here we go. And, so much of that is like showing up and, again, taking up space. Right. If I remember where there was an intern that worked with me and she was almost always being manipulated by them because she let them. Right. And it was like poor boundaries and, again, feelings of shame. And inside of that kind of environment, you really have to, even if you're faking it, right? Like you
Mhm.
really have to show up with like a poker face and just be bold and, like I'm not going to let anyone do this to me today. I'm always allowed to walk away. I can take a day off if I need to. I can terminate any session,
Mhm.
and again, those aren't always the things we're taught in grad school, right? It's like work through it. It's like, no,
No, like, "Oh, client-centered." No.
nope.
Well, and again, like, if you're working depending on the population you're working with, if you're working with addicts, right?
Hmm.
I can't help but think about, I'm training a puppy that was found tied to a balcony for a week without food and water.
Oh my God.
And so of course she's leash reactive,
Right.
right? Of course, because now every time I take her on a walk, she has to be in her trigger, right?
Yeah.
And so, but just what it takes in me, and I notice, and it's so subtle, and we're all these mammals that
Hmm.
respond to people's energy. So if
Hmm.
I go into fear embracing of like, oh shit, there's somebody walking towards me with a dog,
Yeah.
she is an extension of my arm on a
Mhm.
leash. She feels that, and she's already, with her protective, vigilant prey drive, and then me as an extension of her, she's gonna have a bigger reaction versus if I can maintain,
Mhm.
as you said, like a poker face, like a a poker body, just like grounded presence
Yeah.
and letting her know she's safe, that you're okay.
Yeah, it's funny, I have a dog as well, and, pretty much, had a similar experience. I
Oh.
thought he was, like, dog averse for years, right? So I, like, wouldn't take him to the dog park. I'd cross the street when I'd see a dog coming, and then I had a pet sitter, like, I don't know, he was, like,
Mm.
probably 6 or 7. She was like, "Oh, we had the greatest day at the park," and I was like, "What park?" And she's like, "We took him to the dog park." I'm like, "You took my dog to the dog park?" She's like, "Yeah, I take him every time I'm here." And I ended up getting a trainer in response to that, and
Yeah.
the trainer was like, "It's you." But the dog is 100% responding to your fear state, right? You're walking into this and, like, being like, "There's a dog, and he's getting protective, like, just chill out." Like,
Mhm.
show up, be more confident, be the pack leader, right? And, yeah, that is sort of a tool that you carry into other spaces of your
Yeah,
life.
absolutely. I can't remember the
Yeah.
name of the book. There's a woman who, um she was a dominatrix and she was also training dogs, right?
Brilliant.
And or
Yeah.
she was reading a book on dog training and she was realizing and I was like, "Oh, absolutely." A lot of the it was so funny. I use martial arts-based practices to help
Mhm.
rewire people's brains through their body through
Brilliant.
physical exercises, and I was doing a boundary exercise with a client, actually a grab. So, the idea of a literal grab being the metaphoric grab of like things are grabbing us all day, every day that surprise us, that we have a nervous system response to, and how do we reground, observe that, and then turn and face the thing that's grabbing us. And so
Mhm.
I was having her go through each step of this. And so, but she went really quickly from being grabbed to trying to turn and face. And because I'm training my dog, I said to her, stay. Right.
Yep. That sounds right.
It was like my dog training and human training wires got crossed for a second. It was really funny.
Brilliant.
So then your dog, it shifted. So you got some
Yeah.
training, you
Yeah.
built your confidence, and
Yes.
your pup
Yeah.
shifted. I love
Yes.
it.
He's great now. Yeah.
Oh, that's so helpful. How old was he when that happened?
I mean, it was a while in. I think he was like several years. So, that's that whole like you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Like,
Yeah,
I do not subscribe to that. I don't
me
care.
either.
Every being on this planet has the capacity to grow, evolve, and change if there is a willingness to do so.
Well, and that's that key piece, right? I mean, and you worked with one of the hardest populations where it's like, our capacity, the level of rigidity can prevent us from changing.
Yes.
But I don't think we could do the work that we do if we didn't believe that it was possible for people to change,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so right now, are there any things that your programs or classes, things that you're offering that you'd like to share about?
Yeah, so, I do sort of like a whole suite of services. I do therapy. I do offer weekly therapy that's usually few and far between. I've just started recently in the last few months doing what's called a therapy intensive, which is actually quite popular these days,
Mhm.
where it's really designed for the person who, either doesn't has limited availability, right, wants to work with me but can't get into my weekly time, but honestly, more than that, beyond that, it's someone who's looking to sort of like direct dive into a particular
Mhm.
issue. And we get to kind of, I joke, I'm like, it's the Disney Fast Pass. Like we're fast passing healing and we're just kind of talking about the process rather than the details. I incorporate more things into that type of approach where I do things like EMDR. I do more sort of in session somatic
Mm.
processing. So I do that for New Jersey residents. And then I also offer coaching, and my coaching, I always disclaimer this that coaching and therapy are different, right? I can use coaching inside of therapy. I do not use therapy inside of coaching. Coaching is most appropriate for people that are like at this point and are trying to move forward. But though we do talk about emotions and mindset work, it's not related to sort of trauma healing. It's not related to sort of big, patterns in life or histories. But I love doing that work too. And then, among my free services, right? Those are my more premium services, getting to work with me one to one. I am on the Instagram, as I think all of us are these days. Add a note from your therapist. And I offer there, I do free workshops, I do live events. I just launched my own podcast called Becoming Unstoppable. So, I get to interview, experts in their field. And, my hope is while none of these things there's no substitute for mental health treatment. Sometimes we need to just have some of these messages, some of these tools reinforced. And I just do want to at least make sort of the basics of, mindset work, shifting our perspectives, believing in yourself, like all the things again, sounds
Mhm.
cheesy, but I truly believe in.
Mhm.
Um, I want to make that, I want to beat the hell out of that point to everybody who will listen. So think when we all do better and we all believe in ourselves, the world is just going to be a better place. So if I can touch as many human beings on the face of this planet as I have access to inside of this lifetime, and they leave with even just like a nugget of feeling better about themselves, I will have considered it a win.
Beautiful. Speaking of
Yeah.
nuggets, do you
Yeah.
have a 5-minute practice or exercise that you would
Mhm.
like to guide our listeners through?
Yeah. So I have something simple and it's been a bit of a tough sell when I pitch this to clients, but I swear to God it works.
Mhm.
Right. So I fundamentally am a brain science nerd. I believe in the power of shifting our thoughts. And so, sort of in spirituality and the Instagram, we call it mantras or we call it affirmations. I call them neuro pathways. And all I ask my clients to do, we want to start at the most basic, simple thing is I want them every single day to get for 45 days, right? Of just saying 3 kind things to themselves. And they can be the cliche, like, I am beautiful and I am worthy. And that's just fine. They can be like, I think my nails are cool today, right? Like, I don't really care what the sentiment is. It's just the practice of looking at yourself and saying something kind because I truly believe that our self-talk can be very poor and our self-compassion is actually a skill that many of us have missed the memo on. So I asked them to do it for 45 days, 3 things, and I asked them to do it when they brush their teeth because then at least we're pairing it with a habit. If they only want to do it once throughout the day, that's fine, preferably twice. But when I say that to people, they often roll their eyes. And the clients who have actually successfully done it have 100% unanimously all come back and been like, "You know what? I actually do feel a little bit better. I actually am starting to be kind to myself. I am noticing it a little more."
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
that's my little nugget introduction.
It's important because what you're also doing is you're training the person to think of something, like observe, because we all know we have cognitive bias, right? We're always
Mhm.
looking for what's wrong in our environment or the thing that we're afraid of in our environment, but you're reframing and shifting perspective to look for the thing that's beautiful, that's peaceful, that's pleasurable, that's, yeah.
Yeah. Beautiful. I love it.
Mhm.
Peaceful. It's a great word.
Let there be more of that. Oh my gosh, globally,
Absolutely.
internally, we all need that. That's definitely
Mhm.
my word for the year.
Yeah. It's a great
Um,
word.
yeah, and anything else that you would like to share before we start to shift?
You know, Just bottom line, I can't say this enough, each one of us does deserve the right to live a life that we actually like, right? So really learning the skill set of dropping, I always say drop into your body, like just learning to become more self-aware and gentle. Like I can't passively say that enough. It just pivots our entire life if we are coming from a place of clarity and kindness and self-compassion and gentleness rather than that like bullied anxiety, doubt, shame. And so just if you need a place to start, just like, if you're thinking something, just pause and be like, how is this feeling? Right. And if we're feeling something in our shoulders are forward or our teeth are clenched, or we're sweating, that's like a good check engine light that whatever it is that you're doing, there's something to learn here. Or if you're dropping in your body and it feels peaceful, right? Like that's more your intuition, that's not anxiety. And just starting to very slowly kind of pick up your own internal signals. I don't think we do that enough. And I don't think we teach people to do that enough.
Absolutely. Yeah. So good to get to meet you and spend some time.
Likewise.
I'm excited for you about your podcast.
Yeah.
And yeah, hopefully we'll get to
Absolutely.
another time. Thank you for joining us. If you appreciated this episode, please like, rate, review, and share it with your friends. I'd really appreciate that. And if you'd like to stay connected, you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at LaidOPEN Podcast. That's LaidOPEN, all one word. As well as if you go to charnacassell.com, you can join my newsletter where you can get information about upcoming courses, as well as discounts and resources that I share in my newsletter. And if you go to passionatelife.org, you can get more information about my private practice and the kind of work that I do. This has been Laid Open Podcast with your host, Charna Cassell. We all have different capacities, but I believe in our capacity to grow and change together. Until next time.